Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for ALS Webinar Wednesday series. My name is Alejandra Herrera, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for ALS North America. I will be facilitating the webinar today. If you're having technical issues with our webinar platform or you have any questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. You can also select the hand icon to notify me of your status so I can assist you. All questions regarding the webinar material will be answered at the end of the presentation. Our presenter today is Darlene Huggins Stasny. Darlene graduated from Fanshawe Environmental Technology Program in 1992. She has been working in the environmental industry for over 30 years, including 16 years with ALS. Darlene is now the ALS Canada Technical Specialist for Air Quality Testing. Today, Darlene will be discussing EPA 325, the why and how of Passive Fenceline Monitoring SOR 2020231. Darlene, I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Alejandra, and thank you to all who have taken time to listen in on this webinar. For some of you, just to give you a little bit of background on EPA 325, if you are in Canada, this will be something relatively new within the past 3 to 5 years. For anyone from the US, this will be something that you're quite familiar with. So this program was originally started by Exxon working together with ERM, looking at how to continuously monitor for fugitive emissions as they pass by the perimeter of facilities and in turn infringe upon the community at large that are either adjacent or close to the facility, depending on the traveling of the plume. So what we have done is we have taken advantage of looking at our US partners and how this program has gone through, and Environment Canada started a study that we worked on with them out in the Maritimes about 5 years ago, and looked at what compounds were of interest. In the US, they currently monitor for benzene, and we monitored for about 25 different VOCs that can be analyzed. Based on that information and looking at what emissions there are from various facilities that are defined in the regulation, we established that the BTEX and 1,3-butadiene, not we, but Environment Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada established that those were the compounds of interest and would be starting the analysis requirement as of January 2022. So that's a little bit of the why, and I wanted to just delve into a little bit more of where this regulation is going, who is involved, what some of the requirements are, and then further we'll discuss, as far as ALS is concerned, how this passive monitoring works. So with our Simi Valley lab, they have been doing the passive fenceline monitoring with the thermal desorption tubes since about 2010. Our facility in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada has been doing the passive monitoring analysis on the thermal desorption tubes since 2015. And we started a pilot project with Sarnia, Ontario facilities in 2016. In Ontario, these facilities were mandated to monitor for benzene and 1,3-butadiene. And we've been working with 5 facilities in the Sarnia, Ontario area for this particular work. And these facilities do provide public access to their data. So with respect to the regulation, who is included? So there's 18 refineries, 5 upgraders, and 2 petrochemical facilities. These particular facilities are throughout Canada, with most of them being located in Ontario and Alberta. There are a few facilities out in British Columbia. There's one in Saskatchewan. I believe there's one in Manitoba. There's a few in Quebec. And then there are 2 out in the Maritimes. So this really does encompass all of Canada, with exception of the far north. In discussions with some of the companies that are currently looking at this monitoring, we do believe that additional facilities will be added to the list. If you look at the way it's written in the regulations, they do define the fact that the regulations apply to a facility that produces liquid petroleum products by means of processing using distillation of crude oil or bitumen, mixtures of crude oil or bitumen and other hydrocarbon compounds, partially refined feedstock derived from crude oil or bitumen, or produces petrochemical products and is operated in an integrated way with a facility referred to, and it's in a paragraph, there's a little bit more information past that. But this really does encompass a significant number of facilities throughout Canada. At this particular point, the ones identified are the ones that will be started with, but I feel pretty confident that as time goes on, more will be added. The regulation also takes time to define the ALDAR program in quite great detail. So the leak detection and repair program, of which this particular monitoring is part of, is not just defined as far as what it entails, but also how and the type of equipment to be used. So something that you can refer to, and there's actually a link in this presentation that you can look at so that you can see the full regulation. It goes into pretty significant detail on the actual leak detection repair program, equipment, maintenance, and protocols that will be required for this. So it's something that not all of our regulations do to go into that great a detail, but this one is very specific. The other why that is really important is human health. So this regulation was to mitigate some of the fugitive emissions that were happening and were impacting on communities that border or are very close to some of the facilities. In the case of the Sarnia, Ontario area, there are a number of First Nations properties or bands that are immediately adjacent to these properties or just downwind of these particular facilities. And so this was another reason to look at monitoring on a regular basis, tightening leak detection and repair programs, but also coming up with a unified approach so that it was consistent across all. So as I had mentioned before, this is the link to the actual regulation, and it came into effect, I apologize, it came into effect in December of 2020. It has portions that were required starting January 2021 to apply if facilities were looking for modifications of their programs or looking to establish an alternate for testing the applications and the requirements needed to be submitted to Environment and Climate Change Canada to assess, and then in return provide support, information, and decisions so that the actual monitoring, which comes into force in January 2022, can start. The methods that they are using, so the deployment and setup method is method 325A, derived from the US EPA method, and the analytical method is 325B. This also follows closely the analysis or analytical method TO17, which is the instrumentation portion of the analysis. As I'd mentioned before, Environment and Climate Change Canada really was looking to primarily protect and mitigate risk. So reducing fugitive emissions, providing protection, improving human health and environmental quality, and promoting a level playing field across all of the facilities. I think the regulation is intended to harmonize these measures, to be prescriptive as far as how this needs to be put into place, and also to give some more certainty as to what is required under the regulation, what analysis must be done, and what monitoring is done on the fugitive emissions going off of property. The advantage of this particular method of testing or setting up the passive fenceline monitoring allows for continuous monitoring at a reasonable cost. And the reason I say reasonable is because there's a lot of other types of testing that can be done when it comes to air testing that end up involving a significant cost. because there's no pumps involved, because this is a passive method, this particular method allows for continuous monitoring and does not require attendee or a person being there to take the sample other than to switch the tubes in and out every 2 weeks. So it, again, from a labor standpoint, cuts down in cost. And I think that was the other reason for the decision to move to this type of monitoring. Now a little bit about the how. So from left to right, if you look at the far left, this is what a shelter looks like for the thermal desorption tubes. It sits about 1.5 to 2 meters up on along the fence line. It protects the tubes from the weather, so this way no rain gets into it. It's well protected from any snow or any other type of precipitation. But if you look at the very bottom, you can actually see the diffusive caps of the thermal desorption tube sticking out. And that is the principle that the sample is collected by. So the air diffuses across that surface of and there's a screen at the bottom of that tube or that little small cap, and then travels up the tube onto and absorbs onto the resin that is inside. The tubes that are sent out look very much like the one second from the left. They are Carbopax X tubes. They have grooves at the end of the inlet so that when you remove, if you move over to the third picture, when you remove the end nut that is on there, they are ready for deployment. You would then switch that, once you remove that nut, switch it out for a diffusive cap and deploy it into the shelter. The tubes are all numbered and they come to you, if you look on the far right, they come to you in a kit that looks just like this particular one. So depending on the size of your facility and depending on the program, normally there's about this one will actually hold up to 18 tubes. For most facilities, if it's a regular geometric shape, you're probably looking at taking 16 samples. So there would be 12 shelters in place, and per sampling event, 2 blanks and 2 duplicates as per the regulation. The diffusive caps come in a small package. They're at the far right. You can see a small plastic package there. And so that when you pop the end of the tube off, you can actually put the cap back on. These tubes are thermally desorbed, and what that means is we essentially strip them with heat. So the advantage to that particular protocol is that you get a much better recovery than using a desorbing solution. Our recoveries are anywhere from 90% and higher when you use these typical thermal desorption tubes. And the nice part about these particular tubes is they're reusable. Once they're stripped, we actually put them through a cleaning process and then we proof them again. One of the things that is done in this particular process is, although we provide batch proofing for all of the tubes when they're sent out, so that's part of the report, we do individually proof the tubes, and we retain a cradle to grave record for these particular thermal desorption tubes. They all have serial numbers, so that allows us to monitor the cleaning and monitor the quality control on these particular tubes. If at any given time they no longer pass our quality control standards, then the tube is taken out of circulation and replaced with another. For our clients, the advantage to you is that there's no cost for us to replace that tube. We don't ask the clients to purchase the tubes. We retain the records on these particular tubes. If for whatever reason an anomaly shows up on your data, we can actually go back to the cleaning process for that tube, and we can have a look to see and make sure that there was nothing inherent on the tube, to give you that level of comfort and peace of mind to make sure that this tube was exactly clean and contained no other anomaly prior to you receiving it. The easiest way for this program, or the best way for this program to work for clients, is at any given time, one set of tubes will be deployed, one set of tubes will be in your possession, so that when you go to switch the tubes out, you'll have a set to put in, and one set is being cleaned in the lab. And although you don't each have your own individual sets, because that randomization also ensures that there is no chance of a tube getting inherent qualities in there where it's always picking up a certain particular compound. By cleaning them and by randomizing them, we ensure that there is no chance of there being an inherent anomaly that stays in one tube and stays in one spot. So in order to be able to do that, we do have a large number of tubes. The tubes also, once they've been cleaned and deployed, have a hold time. So after they come out, we need to analyze them within 2 weeks' time. So that is the other reason that when you have a set deployed, while it is deployed, another set will come before the 2 weeks is up. If you look at the window of time in the regulation, the replacement has to happen when you take a tube out, you replace it with a new tube. And I believe it does allow a window of time between 13 and 15 days, and that's likely to account for if there are any weather conditions so that the site could possibly not be reached. So there is a window of time of one day either way to allow for that. The continuous sampling works out incredibly well, but one of the things that we do want to keep in mind is that these will not catch event-based emissions in a way that you can actually attribute a date to the emission that happens. What you would do is you would be able to look at that 2-week window of time. If there is a spike in a particular compound, somewhere in that window or somewhere in that 2 weeks would have been when this happened. The rest of your leak detection and repair programs, however, will allot to be able to determine where this emission happened. And what some of our clients have done is they've installed some of these shelters closer to their potential leak spots. So spots where there is a potential or where a high risk of a leak exists. And when they do have an emission, they will order some extra tubes and run a sampling program for a minimum of 3 days, because that's required for tube deployment in order for us to be able to get usable data. And they would then take the tubes for 3 days and submit them for analysis to look at their leak program, repair it, and then look again. So as I'd mentioned before, the tubes that we're using are Carbopac X tubes. So that is the resin that's inside. It's a single resin, and that differs a little bit from the active thermal desorption tubes that you would use for sampling with a pump, in that they would have 3 different types of resin. This one has actually been tested. It is known to be hydrophobic, so it works out really well in that it tolerates moisture. It's very temperature tolerant. The program that is currently running in Ontario has been running continuously since 2016, and the temperature tolerance has been very good. The program that was run out in the Maritimes also ran during part of the winter time, so we know that the tolerance works out fairly well. And we believe that if you looked at the regulation that was up for discussion a number of years ago, there was a discussion to possibly have a dormancy period of 12 weeks. And it appears that Environment and Climate Change Canada has been looking at the data and feels that the temperature tolerance of the tubes and the data relevance is such that continuous monitoring is the way to go with these particular types of thermal desorption tubes. While the requirement for the regulation is only for BTEX and 1,3-butadiene, we just wanted you to be aware that we can look at up to 25 VOC compounds on these particular thermal desorption tubes. And I do have a list at the very end that you can have a look at with respect to that list of compounds. Our list is limited by a few things. One of them is by the uptake rates. So we require an uptake rate for a VOC compound, for a volatile compound, to be able to calculate the concentration. And so we have this particular list currently. There are a few compounds that tend to be a little more challenging to get off of the resin, even thermally. And so they tend to provide a challenge. However, there aren't any in the list that I'll provide for you that we are having too many problems with at this particular point in time. And the BTEX and 1,3-butadiene are pretty much standard. The benzene and 1,3-butadiene are the ones that were currently being monitored. at the various locations. And if you do look at some of the data, just to see what it looks like, to see rolling averages and the volume of data, you'll be able to have a better view of exactly how much data. If you think of 12 sampling points plus dupes and blanks on every 2-week basis, it does end up being with a huge accumulation of data. We currently partner with a number of different consultants for this type of work. There are a few facilities that are doing their own. So while the consultants did set up their initial program and established a manual for them, ultimately they have hired either an intern over a short period of time or a longer term employee to continue to deploy and remove or switch the tubes out. The advantage, I think, to having a partner with this particular expertise is they maintain the data, they provide support to their client, and in turn provide annual reports. If you review the regulation itself, it does require that you would be available for audits, that the data can be looked at and questions can be asked of the particular facilities. As a lab, we definitely are there to help you when it comes to providing the quality control and the information, but we aren't consultants, and we don't provide recommendations based on, you should do more sampling or you should set up another sampling point here. That really does fall to some of our partner consultants. Just a little bit more about the media that's included in this particular Carbopac X. So it talks a little bit about the BTEX and 1,3-butadiene. The volume is really, the range is from C3 to C8. That is optimal. The tubes themselves are probably about the size of your middle finger in length. And so they are quite small. They are quite temperature tolerant. When it comes to shipping them back and forth, they can be shipped at ambient temperature. They do not require a chilling, or so that they don't need to be received at below 10 degrees C. That makes them also another great type of analyses or great type of sampling collection media, because so many times when you're dealing with different types of air media, temperature affects drastically how you can sample, where you can sample, how long you can sample. So the fact that these are dealing with ambient temperatures works out very well. So how does the passive sampling work? As I'd mentioned before, it's passive diffusion. So the tube opening is facing down. There are 2 grooves at the end of the tube to show what the inlet is. It is important that that diffusive cap go on, because the passive diffusion or the uptake rate is based on having that cap on, because there is a slight airspace between the end of that cap and the end of the tube when it's placed on there, and the size of the screen. All of that is calculated into this uptake rate. So it is important to make sure that those caps are put onto the tubes and again removed when the tubes are capped and returned. These are the compounds I had mentioned earlier that we have uptake rates for and that we are currently able to provide analysis for. So why is that important? Because for some of the facilities, in order to get a better picture of what they are doing, they are currently monitoring. We do have a couple of facilities in Ontario that are currently doing this full list. They only are required to report the benzene for their public reporting data, but they monitor all of these on a regular basis, and the cost difference isn't that significant. Having this extra data is relevant. It also allows for them to be able to plot plumes. So that's, again, when you're working together with a consultant, or if you are working with someone on site who is monitoring the data and looking at the reporting portion of it, you can actually track, because you are looking at the full perimeter of your property, you can track which way the plume has gone. And looking at the concentration of the results at one tube versus the ones that radiate out from there, you can actually target the exact direction that that plume has taken over a 2-week period. There are 2 different ways that you can establish the placement of the shelters for the thermal desorption tubes, and one of them is radial. This would be based on a geometric shape of the facility being fairly regular, and it would be at 30-degree radians, again, 12 sampling points minimum, or linear, so you can go equidistant along the perimeter, the boundary of the facility. There are a number of facilities that we're aware of that are separated. So the facilities are separated such that either there's a green space in between, or there are two different impingement points. And so those facilities have had to look, because they are large, have had to look at having two different sets of perimeters for their passive monitoring programs. One of the things that we are offering is for the facilities, we do source the shelters, and the shipping back and forth is covered by ALS. So that generally we find really assists our clients. You know, we do like to get a commitment again for 1 or 2 year program, but it does assist our clients knowing that they don't have to worry about the shipping costs in addition, because they can become pretty significant when you're looking at shipping these. We have a number of locations across the country for ALS, and so these tubes can be submitted to those locations, and that particular ALS location will take care of shipping those back to our location in Waterloo at no cost to our clients. I wanted to just put this back in there. I had originally taken this out, but direct reading instruments still are incredibly useful when it comes to your leak detection and repair programs. They do help in targeting areas of emission, and they're still definitely helpful when it comes to try and figure out if you're going to add additional sampling points that you would use on an intermittent basis when you are having fugitive emissions or when you are seeing higher readings. You're looking at things like handheld PIDs or a weather station. In most cases, will only assist in this particular program. When Environment and Climate Change Canada initially put this out, one of the things they had discussed when we sat down with them as stakeholders, so there was a number of different facilities that sat down with them, was requiring GC instrumentation, so these type of weather stations, to be installed at multiple locations, but it became cost prohibitive to have facilities have multiple of these, not only because of maintenance, but also because of monitoring. They would require someone to monitor them constantly. And if you had multiple sets of these installed along your property lines, it would, just between maintenance and the requirement for monitoring, it would require a large number of staff hours to be able to continue to do this. If you'd like to look at some of the historical data for this particular program, the data from 2016 to 2020 for benzene can be seen at on these particular websites. There was a requirement by Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks of Ontario to publicly post this particular data. And so the facilities that were doing this were Suncor, Shell, IOL, and INEOS Styrolutions. So you can have a look at this data just to see what the volume is like, what the data looks like. There is a specific QC requirement, is a specific quality control requirement that we are providing for this. The data is provided in Excel format. The way that we provide our clients the tube IDs is we provide the chain of custody in an Excel format, and then we provide the tube IDs, which are the serial numbers on the tubes, as well in an Excel format every time we send a shipment out. And we actually track those tube IDs so we know which clients are getting which tubes, but you can actually cut and paste those right onto a chain of custody. It saves transcription error. It makes your job much easier when you're looking at putting field notes together. And from a time standpoint, I think it saves time for our clients to be able to take that information. So right now, every 2 weeks, you get an email with your tube IDs, and that can be cut and pasted right into a chain of custody, and that can then in turn go with your field staff when they're putting the tubes, when they're removing tubes and putting tubes back in. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. I know I've gone through this pretty quickly. I was trying to keep this to about 30 minutes just so that we're not going on and on about things that most of you will be familiar with the regulation. I wanted to touch on some of the things that are integral to having this program as far as the lab is concerned, and for us to be able to do a good job for you. But I'm certainly willing to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Darlene. Before we begin the Q&A, I would like to ask everybody to take 2 minutes to complete our survey. The link is in the chat section. We would love to hear your feedback. We will open the forum for questions now. Please write out your questions using the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of this webinar. I will give everyone a few minutes to type in your questions. In the meantime, I will review some brief notes. This webinar presentation has been recorded. All participants of this webinar will receive a follow-up email once the recording is available to view. We also post our webinars on our ALS Global website and our ALS YouTube channel in the webinar playlist. Also, please follow our company page on LinkedIn as we post announcements and registration links to further webinars and other resources and updates. Okay. We have a question from Brian. Is there new criteria, CCME, to compare results from these methods?
So to my knowledge, this regulation doesn't fall under CCME. I have to be honest, I have not seen a reference to CCME for this particular regulation. The criteria that are laid out, I believe, are by facility, and I would be happy to just double check that further. I'm going to take that note down, Brian, and if you would be so kind, Alejandra, to pass Brian's contact info, I will get you that information exact. I'm not 100% sure. I have to apologize. I don't, as far as CCME, this doesn't fall under CCME criteria. This particular regulation is independent because it falls under the petroleum sector.
Okay. Julie is asking, how many samples are located in one shelter?
So there's enough spots in a shelter for up to 4 tubes. There is 1 tube per shelter, and per the requirement of the regulation so nominally most facilities must have at least 12 monitoring points and 2 blanks and 2 duplicates. So the current process of doing this would be to rotate the duplicates and blanks through the different sampling points. The blanks are kept sealed. Both ends are sealed. The tube simply sits in that shelter. The duplicates, obviously, the cap comes off and it's a diffusive cap, and they are duplicates that sit side by side. But there's enough space within the shelters for 4 tubes. The most that would be in there for this particular program is likely 2.
Mallory is asking, are you aware of the public reporting requirements for the upcoming federal regulation? Will it be similar to the Ontario requirements?
So I actually asked this question of Jeremy Grant, who is my contact at the petroleum sector for Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the discussion is currently that, yes, the requirement will be similar to the current public posting that is happening in Ontario.
Do we have any more questions? Well, it looks like that's all. Thank you for attending this webinar today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you very much, everyone.